Kumla about Gemara. Today's daf is Daf Yudches Amid Aleph. This is Thursday's Gemara. We are up to Daf Yudches Amid Aleph by the two dots about 9 lines on top of the page. So now the Bryce is continuing making distinctions between a male Eved and a female. So what we learned. Yesh be ivri she'ein b'ivri that didn't apply to a male Eved that doesn't apply to a female. But yesh be ivriya she'ein b'ivri. Now, Yesh be ivri, I'll tell you what we have. Shu yaitze b'shanim, 6 years he goes out, which doesn't happen by maid, which is difficult, as we know in the Mishnah says clearly they do. Uvi yovel, the yovel goes out, and a maid doesn't, but we know they do. Uvi mises or other, the master dies, by a male he goes out, by a female he doesn't, and we know that she does, so we'll have to work out the Gemara. Mashenkin be ivriya. Mashenkin when it comes to a maid. The yesh be ivriya sheya had ivriya yaitziv someone reaches puberty, he goes out, not by male. The ein on the mekadesh finish, it cannot be sold a second time. Umaflin oisa bal korcha, and we redeem them against the person's will. And we're not sure exactly which person we're referring to, as we'll see in the Gemara. Mashenkin be ivriya. Now we will explain each one. Although we learned, yes, there's something that applies to a male, not a female, but Aminu says clearly on Mishnah, you say the love of it. He has all the exit releases like a male, she has as well. But in addition, she some money, she goes out with puberty. The Mishnah Bryce are talking about two different cases. Our Bryce is talking about she got married to the master. If she got married to the master, then obviously she doesn't go with you, she's a wife. And the Mishnah talking about she didn't get married. So you are the pshita, then obviously get the boy needs a get. No, Mao would have thought that even though he married her, but all the releases that we said before should still apply. Kamashalon, that it doesn't. Says the Gemara, so when she reaches puberty, if she's married, she doesn't go anywhere. If they didn't get married, then she goes out with puberty. You can't sell a second time. Then everybody can be sold a second time. But Tanya, we learned that a male, not a female, a male who stole and can pay back. Then we sell them, and for that, and for the money, pays back the Gneva. We have a very interesting halacha here, which is in logic very difficult to understand. But this is exactly the cost. It says big Gneva when he stole. The big failure. If he stole and there's a penalty, he gets sold for the Gneva if he can't afford to pay, but he does not get sold for the double. Number one. If they were false witnesses trying to put on someone that he was a guy, pretend to be that they're liars, they have to pay, but if they can't pay, they don't get sold as slaves. And big nevos like you can't sell the second time. So here in the second price it says you cannot sell an eved the second time, and the first price says an eved is different than an eved could be sold. Amar Rav Lekasha. Can be gneva achas can beshtei gnevas. There's a difference, one gneva and two gnevas. That that when it comes to one gneva, let's say if the gneva is not exactly the amount that he's worth being sold as a slave, you don't sell a slave. For example, if he's worth $1,000 and the gneva is 500, you don't say, oh, let's sell for 3 years. It doesn't work that way. And or if he's worth $500, they do $1,000. Don't say, okay, let's sell it once and then sell it the second time, so it'll make up for the $1,000. We don't do that. Now, but shtei gnevas will do. That's about two gnevas. That if there were two gnevas, even though they were tried at the same time, we'll sell them twice. Two separate gnevas, even if it's the same person. Says the Gemara, it sounds like, but how many gnevas he made if they were tried at the same time? They are considered one gneva and it can only be sold once. If you stole from one person, it can only be sold once. If they get all tried at the same time. If they're tried different times, each time is a different sale. But we're just making a distinction between one person and two people. If he can stole from different people, he gets sold twice. Tell me, we learned if you stole $1,000, he's worth 500. Nimke gets sold twice. He stole 500, he's worth 1,000. We don't do less than 6 years. You don't sell it all. It has to be exacted. Let's go further. Exactly the same nimka. Has to be exact. How often does it happen that a person's value is exactly the amount that he stole? In this case, Rabbi Lezer definitely has won the argument against the Rabbanan. Because what's the difference? What's the difference if the Geneva is worth 500 and he's worth 1,000? Since it's not the same. Ein Nimke, the Nimke Kul Rachmana V'Lechetzi. How can I say here? Nimke begenevasa Melachmana, but the Nimke bechatkin was not be sold for half. It's about Korcha. So we don't know about Korcha. Who's about Korcha? Other things that we're going to force the master to set him free. To set her free. Only by my new, because what do you mean force it? Because you have no money and you give him an IOU and you say, look, release her. Am I? Why should he? Nokid Marganis, he's holding on to a diamond, biyad in his hand, a precious stone. You give him a piece of clay, a paper, an IOU. Why should you? What right do you have to force this person to release this girl? We force the father. It's a blemish on the family that they allowed their young daughter to be sold as a slave. So we forced the father to buy her back. It's also a blight in the family that one of the members of the family is allowed to be sold as a slave. So what it says, because by there, if he sold himself, it's because he needs the money. What's going to stop the guy 3 months later to sell himself again? And every time you're going to force the family to set him free, there's no protection. And therefore, I said, same thing, why aren't you worried about her? That you can keep on, the father will keep on reselling her again. Where it says, you cannot sell a girl twice. Now we're going to discuss, can you sell a girl twice or not? And we're going to have a number of opinions. Umani Rab Shimon, in this follows the view of Rab Shimon. Can be learned. A person can sell a young daughter let me sell. A person can go ahead and marry off his young daughter, and he receives the money for Kiddushin. And then what happens if she becomes a widow or she's divorced? But from the engagement, she didn't fully consummate the marriage. He can marry off again, and again the money goes to him, as long as she's under 12. Under 12 and a half. The Shaina repeated. The Shivcha is Rishaina, he can sell her as a maid, and then it could come the 6 years expire, or the able as before she's 12 years old, or the master dies, he can sell her a second time. But once she's obviously 12 years old and she goes free because of puberty, he can't sell her again. He can also sell her, let's just hold her as a maid and the master died and she said free, he can marry her off if she's younger than 12 and keep the money. Young and 12 and a half. According to this Tana, you cannot sell her as a maid. Once you gave her away as a wife to someone, you can no longer sell her as a maid. She's out of your control, and you cannot sell her anymore, even though she's younger than 12 and so on. I'm talking about a case where, let's say, the husband died, so she became a widow. That's one opinion. Shimon says no. Just like you cannot sell your daughter as a maid once she was married, you cannot sell her as a maid once she was a maid. You cannot sell her as a maid after marriage, nor can you sell her as a maid after a maid. Actually, this is a machlekes similar to another machlekes tonight. Tanya, we learned, it says in the pasuk, if the master did not marry this girl, which he should have, and he should not then pass on to another person to marry her, because the big doiba. Now, big doiba can have two definitions. It's written, it's big doiba. Big doiba meant address. Usually, it's a yud to make it a chirik. There's no yud here, so it can be read b'bog doiba, he betrayed her, or big doiba by covering her which basically is a sign of a chuppah or getting married. So the first opinion is kivan shepirish talisala. Once he married her off. Shuv ein rashel amoich. You can no longer give it to another nation. You cannot give it. So once she's married, you cannot then sell her again. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Lezer says the big debo. Rabbi Lezer says the big debo actually is bebog debo, which means betrayed. Kivan shebogaba. Since you sold her as a slave, you betray your own daughter. Shuv ein rashel amoich. You can no longer sell her as a maid again. What's going on? And why does one of them say the big day means that you covered her, which is a sign of marriage, and the other says the bug when you betrayed? So Mike Abelezer holds yesh ein l'misayir. We have a word, the way it's written, or it's read. If you read it too, read it is different than the way it's written. Which is the main one? Abelezer says the main one is the way it's written. Rabbi Akiva says the way it's read. And since there's no yud over there, Rabbi Akiva says there's no yud. Akiva says we follow the way it's read, and even though there's no yud, we read it, but big day. Therefore, it's addressed. And Rabbi says since there's no yud there, we follow the Mercedes. And Rabbi Akiva saw the yesh eim mikra, and therefore he says it's big day closed. But Rabbi Shimon Sava Yesh Ein, and Rabbi Lezer says it's Mercedes, the way it's written. So it's Bebog when betrayed, which means you sold a slave. And Rabbi Shimon Sava Yesh Ein Lemiklu Mercedes. They're both correct, as long as they don't contradict each other. Just adding more dinim. If there's a contradiction, then there's the big machlekes that we'll have in the Gemara the whole sugi of Yesh Ein Lemikra Yesh Ein Mercedes. And there's an interesting riff. He wants to know why it's called Ein, not of. You know, we have a binyan of and an Ein Lemikra. Why is that? Talk about it then. Study about it further. Boy, Rabba Baravua, that's the interesting question. Yud, when the master goes ahead and marries the daughter, Yud does that do a full marriage or just engagement? What's it up from Yorsha? If he's fully married, he inherits her. The Tamil of the coin, he gets the Tamil or the Hafendra, and to annul her. My. Again, we had the same thing last time. Everyone knows the difference being engaged and being married. I suddenly have to ask what the difference is. And the simple difference is if she's engaged and tries to adultery, skilla. If you're married, you're trying to marry. I mean, what's the point of the going to only highlight these 3 points and get the exact same thing last time? But what's the difference engaged when you're married? Then you want further. Toshma coming here, it says the pasuk the big keep once he covered her once he covered me on top of the page of Akiva says he could no longer sell her. Once he got married, he could no longer sell her. So it sounds like he could no longer sell her. But he could get a marriage to someone else if let's say he married once, can marry, and then her husband died, can marry a second time. Now, the question is, what did you do? If you can tell me this suyin, I said, if you tell me what the master, that what the yield, then it does the suyin, even the nisas should once she got married, fully married, the father has no rights anymore with what he cannot enroll in the Torah anymore, and so on. Because once she was married, he had no rights, so therefore afterwards he has no rights. And the husband and so on and so forth. So the question is, if you tell me that Yid does fall a suyin, what do you mean he cannot sell but he could marry her for a second time? He can marry her for a second time. That's it. He has no rights anymore if Yid isn't a suyin. It must be that Yid only does Emerson, and therefore the father still has, just like that girl, if she got engaged and then her husband died or something, the father can marry her for a second time. The same thing here. So we see that Yid is really Emerson. Who said we're talking about you? We meant a slave. We're talking about ordinary Kiddushin. This is what he says. We don't know what the din of by a slave and by you. We're talking about ordinary Kiddushin. Married of once, but only Erison. And he can marry her for a second time. Once he gave her over to, he got her engaged as a wife. If the husband dies, the father can marry a second time. But but he can no longer sell her as a slave. That's what it's saying here. So regarding yield, we have no idea what yield does. Okay, Toshma coming in, you should not sell your daughter to a relative because they cannot marry her even if you shouldn't have a lesson. You could marry relatives. Look, the trader says in the midst of yield, if you can't, but the relative, fine. But everyone agrees, technically, but you're allowed to sell an almana to a kohen gadol. You're allowed to sell an almana to a kohen gadol. People was allowed, but technically they get married, they're married. But there is also kohen hedyot. Now let's understand, how is it possible for a young girl to be a widow? We just said before that once you're a widow, you can't sell again. So how can you sell once she's a widow? How can you sell her again? We're talking about if she decided to get married herself, a young minor. What's the point of that? Why is she a widow? She was never married in the first place. The father married her off. We just said before that even if he just got her engaged, you can no longer sell her. How can you then sell her to a kohen gadol? How can you sell her? You cannot sell her. We're talking about not that she married her as a regular husband and wife, but this is he sold as a slave, as a slave, and the master married her. That's Yud. And leave it. This follows Yud. Basically, which we learn later about the Chacham hold the money, the original money that the father received for her slavery. That money is the money that can be used for Kiddushin. Yaitzi says, no, that original money cannot be used for Kiddushin. Later on, tomorrow, the Gemara will explain what's the difference in halacha between the two. But according to Yehuda, how does he marry her? Because he says, look, you still owe me time, and that's worth money. I'm moichel you the rest of that time, and because I own the property, I own it well, I'm moichel the time so different you can be my wife. And that's the Kiddushin that he gives her, the chila of that debt. And it's different than a normal Makadish bill we learned before. Kadesh is a different story, as we'll see. If you can tell me, you can tell me the very first time already considered married, which means that she was a married person. If the husband then dies, how can you sell to Kohen Gadol? We said that once you're married, you can no longer sell her. You're going to have to then say that Yid only makes Edison, and that's why you can sell it after. And the Ella, my Edison runs back. So what are you going to tell me? Only Edison. But didn't we say before that even a father married off a daughter Edison, he can no longer sell it? Even after Edison, you cannot sell your daughter. What's the difference with Edison and Sweden? Ella, you can tell me, shiny Edison did not Edison. You can tell me now. If Edison is from the father, if the Edison is from a father, then he gave it up so that he can no longer sell afterwards. But if the Edison is, let's say, the master decided, but obviously you don't go according to the AC, about Yehuda, it's not the father collecting money in the beginning. This is the master between the master and her. So it's her decision to marry. Therefore, because it's from her, in that case, if it's only Edison, the father has a right to sell her again. If that's the case, so why can't we then not just argue that Yid doesn't sue as well, and Shine and Suin did not, and Suin Levia? And there's a difference between a case of the father marrying off his daughter, or when it's between her and the master. What's the chilik Edison and the Suin? So we could learn that it's Nusuyin, Yid does Nusuyin, and yet it's no problem why the father can sell her again, because it's not really considered Nusuyin. It didn't come from the father. So what are you talking about? Bishlema, Edison is shiny. I understand why Edison is different. And why it's very different from each other, because we'll say that the father if the father gave her up, okay, he loses his rights. And he should no longer be able to sell her. But in this case of here, she's a slave, and the master did it. Okay, he doesn't lose his rights. El Nusuyim and Nusuyim, me shiny. Why should be different? Nusuyim, the Torah says that if you're married, that then you're no longer in your father's ashus. What's the difference if it came from the father or it came from the master? The fact is, once she's married, while she's married, she's no longer father's ashus. Father has no longer a right to sell her. Says the Gemara, according to Nachum Yitzchak, says that even according to Yehuda, he has a different interpretation of Yosef by Yehuda. We'll see later in the Gemara tomorrow. And he held that even according to Yehuda, the original money that was given for her to become her slave, that's the money that's going to be used for Kiddushin. How we're going to understand how it's possible that after she was married, the father should still be able to sell her as a slave to a Kohen Gadol, as a widow to a Kohen Gadol. That can be. Ablezer holds that you cannot have a maid after a maid. But you could have a maid after marriage. This is a maid after marriage. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow.